So the basic idea of the Anthropocene has been referred to as the geology of mankind, or the geological age of man. And the central point is that human activity has acted like a great force of nature, like, in inverted commas, a great force of nature, so that human activity has started to shape not just the climate, and we tend to think of these kind of large-scale environmental change. Climate change is the one that has kind of occupied the place in public discourse and politics and so on. But rather, it's a kind of even broader kind of idea, the idea that the Earth is made up of several interconnected systems governing the kind of bio-geophysical processes of the Earth. And the Anthropocene is changing all of those. So it kind of goes beyond climate change. It involves the change in ocean acidity, the different use of the land, as well as the carbon cycle, ice coverage, the production of new substances, new metals, plastics, chemical and radioactive substances, change of this biosphere, the extinction of species and so on. So it's kind of something which tries to holistically bring together all those changes. I'll talk a little bit more about the importance of origin stories in the Anthropocene. A lot of the debate turns around origin stories, and almost every talk on the Anthropocene has to mention the kind of origins of the idea, which I'll stick to form and do here. It emerged from a Nobel Prize-winning atmospheric scientist called Paul Crutzen, a Dutch scientist, in the year 2000. And he apparently invented this phrase basically in a moment of frustration at a conference when he was trying to express the kind of extent of the human impact on the Earth system. And he said, now we're into a whole new age of Earth, the Anthropocene. And traditionally, words that end in the form "ocene" have been used in geology to define the different ages of the Earth. So we apparently currently now officially live in the Holocene, and there's a move to try and make the Anthropocene now that the official geologic age of the Earth. The Anthropocene has been seen to kind of resonate and kind of with this the idea that the human nature distinction is collapsing, because that's been kind of a growing awareness of that fact due to climate change, most likely or most prominently, but then also in the kind of theoretical field, it's kind of chimed with all these kind of theories that have been emerging over the last number of decades, feminist new materialism, assemblage theory, complexity theory, and more recently, object-oriented ontology, speculative realism, and so on. And there's an unfortunate tendency to kind of just people to throw out the Anthropocene, therefore object-oriented ontology, or the Anthropocene, therefore Latour. This is the kind of murky stew that I was talking about in the text that Susanna quoted. But certainly those things have kind of helped each other gain prominence. Even if there's been very poor attempt to analytically see what the relationship between these types of theories might be and the Anthropocene, they've certainly emerged and kind of resonated together in the kind of reception of the Anthropocene. So in some sense, what you have here is a kind of a demystification of nature, the idea that nature was a myth, and the Anthropocene reveals that it was a myth. But this is interpreted in various different ways, and it's taken to have political consequences in a number of different ways. And one kind of major tendency is the kind of one that I would associate with Eco-Modernism. I'll talk a bit more about that, but also with forms of, which is what I look at in my academic work now, ideas of Earth systems governance. The idea that, okay, so the Earth is made up of this set of complex interrelated systems, and that they're changing, and that's what we call the Anthropocene, and the change makes problems for humans, therefore we have to manage it. And that's the basic impulse of Earth systems governance, which is an idea being developed by think tanks that are kind of, again, mostly European, state-funded by the EU and other state bodies to try and think of frameworks for governing the Earth system. How would that work through kind of political institutions? And the tendency here, as it is in eco-modernism, is to kind of say that, well, we used to all have this anthropocentric way of thinking where we focused on humans as being separate from and above nature. Humans were the center of our way of understanding the world, and the Anthropocene has put that in question. But the anthropocentrism is just smuggled in the back door, because there's kind of an argument of, well, there's no pure nature that can be preserved separate from humanity. That's an idealism, that's a myth. So therefore we can do what we like. And there's kind of this weird sleight of hand where the fact that there's no pure nature, there's a demystification of nature, doesn't demystify man, or doesn't demystify humanity or humanity's power to act and shape that no longer ideal nature. And this works to kind of remove nature from politics. So in some sense, the argument is that our traditional way in modern political thought, we made a distinction between humans and nature. Now that distinction is gone, but the end result is that nature is kind of excluded from politics. It just, again, becomes a thing to be manipulated, resourced, or a resource to be managed and shaped. So you have a kind of a version of post-nature or post-natural condition, which is also post-political. So nature is removed from politics. So the opposing tendency to that, which is another way of reading the kind of post-natural world, which comes up in various different ways and long history of political ecology, but also in a lot of the new materialist writings and Bruno Latour and people like this, is to not remove, remove nature from this mythical status, but not remove it from politics, to put nature precisely into politics, to make it something which is contested, something which enters into the sphere of antagonism of the political. And so the move here is not to say that here's a unified collective nature and there must be a certain politics about that, but rather that there's various forms of social natural interaction, and that those are very complex interactions, but the politics lies in understanding or trying to grapple with the various plural and messy forms of social natural interaction. So in this move, kind of, we get rid of one nature and accept instead plural natures, and that those plural natures are what's in the political sphere. So you're not taking nature out of politics, just taking one big nature out of politics and putting politics into a kind of messy socio-natural entanglements. So the crisis of, also, let's say the Anthropocene has been understood in some way by some people to kind of enter into, kind of add an extra intensity or expanse to the kind of more older idea that there's a crisis of left politics, which is connected to a kind of crisis of historical time where, you know, we've lost the belief in the future, belief in progress, belief in modernization, development, and all these things. And much of the reason for that loss of belief has been, let's say, the result of powerful kind of critiques of the universalizing history of Western modernity that's kind of built into these ideas of progress, and also the kind of failure of the development, the ideas of progress that were promised in the 19th and 20th century to be realized without cost, whether that was environmental or social. So the kind of costs, the expenditures of those forms of modernization, development have been kind of coming back to clearly bite everyone in the ass with climate change and so on. And this has been tied to the disintegration of kind of old political subjects, those who were supposed to be the bearers of this history, whether that was, you know, labor struggles or anti-colonial struggles and so on. The idea that these kind of political subjects have disintegrated, and because of that, there's no one to kind of bear progress, no one to bear the future, and that kind of whole traditional modern future-oriented politics has started to kind of fall apart. And in some sense, the Anthropocene is kind of an amplification of that tendency in thought. So kind of intensifies the crisis of left history being a crisis of historical time or conceptions of historical time. Now, most of the critics in the kind of social sciences, humanities, and things that you might be familiar with, they criticize these narratives that come from the earth scientists, whether it's the mainstream kind of industrialization one or the early Anthropocene one, because they presume a certain subject, a certain agent or actor, which is inherent to this idea of change, which is the Anthropocene in the Anthropocene, a singular, universal humanity, mankind, man, however people choose to call it. The critics suggest that it's not man, it's not humanity, it's not kind of mankind that's responsible or produced kind of this planetary change, but rather historically specific forms of social power, forms of social relations, which produced these vast planetary changes. And that therefore there's not a collective human responsibility for the Anthropocene, but rather a kind of uneven responsibility. Some people are responsible for it, others aren't. And also some people are vulnerable to it and others aren't. Maybe eventually everyone will be ultimately vulnerable to this planetary change. But as it is, and as it has historically been, and as it looks like it will continue to be, that is not the case. The vulnerability to environmental change is extremely uneven and structured by forms of social power. So the attacks kind of go to this attacking the anthropos, the kind of universal humanity embedded in the term Anthropocene. And hence you have this kind of profusion of different names, which all take the form something ocene, like X-ocene. You can put in whatever value you like. And probably the one which has had most traction and most kind of analytic take-up is this idea of the capital ocene, which is connected most to Jason Moore and Donna Haraway, and the idea that it's in fact capitalism which has been the driver of planetary change, not humanity as such. There's also the Eurocene, the Anglocene, the Manthropocene, the Technocene, and they go on and on. And more recently, I think it's probably the most interesting case for me is the idea of the Plantationocene, which doesn't run off the tongue immediately, but it's been connected to Anna Singh, an anthropologist who Susanna mentioned at the start. And the idea here is that, in fact, it's European colonialism in the rest of the world which has produced the Anthropocene. And so the idea that it's the plantation both of crops and the forms of labor that were produced around these plantations which has driven and produced this kind of planetary change. And this has kind of chimed with some work by earth scientists. There's a paper came out last year which was very, very widely discussed and talked about by two British earth scientists who said that you could provide a very, very precise, scientifically verifiable evidence for the Anthropocene or planetary scale environmental change having happened within a few decades of Europeans colonizing North American continent. And the reason for this was essentially that they moved so many species between North American continent and Europe, and also Africa, India, the exchange of kind of biomatter, but also the fact that most of the human population, which was not extremely large, but was wiped out by genocide and disease, and that produced a change in the traditional forms of land use that were on the American continent, which often, in fact, Europeans considered not to be land use. A lot of the argument was they're not using the land. Look at them, they're nomads, or they're sitting around doing nothing. They're not using the land. Of course, they were using the land, but just not in recognizable ways to European agriculture of the time. But that the loss of human population in the North American continent and the lack of cultivation of the land in traditional ways meant there was a huge amount of crops grew back, essentially. So you had this kind of, like these visions of the earth after us, where like New York is covered with weeds. Then you had the plains of the North American continent with lots of vegetation growing back, which was kept down before by herding buffalo, controlling forest fires, and so on. And this actually sucked so much carbon out of the air, rather than putting carbon into the air, which is the usual industrialized conception of the Anthropocene. It sucked so much carbon out of the air into that plant matter that's now detectable in, they drill into the ice in the Antarctic to get the soil below, and they can find these like deep suppositories of soil from centuries ago, and this is the argument they make. So you even now have earth scientists making the claim that European colonialism is the origin of the Anthropocene, not just kind of social theorists. So Eco-Modernism is this idea that kind of originates with the Breakthrough Institute, which is a kind of liberal, so-called new environmentalist think tank based in California. It's probably not a surprise that they're kind of located in California, in Berkeley. Like very kind of infused with this kind of California technology, California ideology, where they think that we can innovate our way out of crisis. So for them, the problems of climate change, or let's say the crisis that the Anthropocene indicates, or they want to say the Anthropocene is an opportunity, not a crisis, are technological in nature, not political. So the solutions are technological, not political. And politics is in fact just a block. It's a blockage which prevents the technological solutions being put in place. So in some sense, they want to get rid of politics so that they can use technology to fix things. And so you can say, in a sense, that they collapse the human nature distinction, but they only collapse it on one side. So they topple this reified nature to say that we should manage nature now. So they reify man. They topple the nature side of the human nature distinction, but they keep the man side. And the binary returns in kind of even more stark terms, where they have these very like bombastic, hubristic claims about human control of the planet. But what kind of interests me about them is that they're relentlessly optimistic. And they list, both in their kind of manifesto, which they brought out a couple of years ago, and also repeatedly in their other writings and talks and so on, that optimism is a key virtue. So they hope to kind of win the future away from the naysayers. And there's been some very interesting discussions between some of the people involved with eco-modernism and their critics around the question of optimism and pessimism, where their critics rightly point out that they can afford to be optimism, and their optimism is kind of an ideological move to make anyone who says anything critical sound like they're a naysayer, an old environmentalist, just a complainer who's not doing stuff and not being on the good foot and the good Anthropocene. So accelerationism and eco-modernism are kind of two different versions of a kind of optimistic vision of the future, which kind of comes around at the minute. Not totally without merit in either case, but somewhat sinister nonetheless. But what I've seen in kind of response to both of them and the kind of conversations, the critical conversations that happen around, that there's a terrible tendency, which is very worrying and very depressing and so on the kind of critical theory left, let's say, which is, I guess, my peers' critical theory left, something like that left kind of political discourse in the conceptual sphere, in the social sciences, humanities, the arts, and so on, a kind of blind pessimism, where optimism is itself seen as some kind of like dangerous delusion, or maybe at best a kind of complicity with existing forms of power. So anyone who's saying anything optimistic is either like an idiot or is somehow, even unwittingly, working to kind of solidify existing kind of forms of power or processes. And I think in this there's a kind of danger that optimism is kind of ceded as such to reactionary forces, that optimism is itself inherently seen to be reactionary. And I think that there's a number of kind of thinkers around that kind of celebrate pessimism as thinkers on the left, who celebrate pessimism as a foundation for a kind of a radical eco-politics. But for me, the Anthropocene tells us, including all the critiques of what the Anthropocene is not just that another world is possible, but another world is inevitable. So we're inevitably going to face different conditions, fundamentally. So we need to kind of face that and try and deal with how that might play out. Yet there's more than one possible future. It doesn't mean that everything is determined in a certain way. So it's inevitable the world will change. It's not inevitable how it will change. So we don't have the power to control the future, as the eco-modernists would tell us, but we do have the power to shape it in some ways, in certain instances. So you kind of might say that maybe we're all fucked, but there's more than one way to be fucked. So I kind of tend to end up in this kind of very uncomfortable kind of Gramscian perspective, and I kind of half say this jokingly, that it's kind of, Gramsci used to talk about pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. It's kind of somewhere where I stand, although I'm very suspicious of the idea of will, of this kind of like, individualistic voluntarism where, you just have will and you'll sort things out, like the kind of optimism of Alain Badiou kind of thing. And it's not very satisfying to have this kind of pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, to say that, well, we kind of are fucked, but we still have to do something about it to make ourselves less fucked. It's not a very satisfying vision. It's not a very promising, great thing that you can get behind, but there doesn't seem to be much other choice. And I've never been a great believer in heaven or hell, and that's kind of the tendency of the legacy of thinking in these theological terms hangs very heavy behind Western political thinking. Heaven's always seemed to be, it might be someone else's heaven and I wouldn't like it, and hell will certainly be mine and I definitely wouldn't like it. So there's no kind of redemption here, but also the kind of no kind of definite apocalypse, no kind of catastrophe which we can then say, oh, we exist already in the ruins of civilization. This seems to me like just terribly cliched and kind of a bit juvenile in a weird way. But I'm going to stop there because I've talked way too long. But I can talk more about some of those things if people have questions. Okay. Thanks for listening.